morning Clara Vale's life changed forever began like any other in the rural settlement of Cooper's Hill. A thick mist hung low over the fields, swallowing the edges of barns and fence posts. The air smelled of damp hay and wood smoke, a scent that announced both life and decay. Somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed, a sound that usually promised routine and safety. But that morning it echoed differently, hollow and distant, as if warning of something coming. Clara Vale stood by her window, porcelain teacup trembling slightly in her hand. She was only 34, but solitude had carved her face in ways time couldn't. Her husband, Jonathan Vale, had died 6 months prior in what the town doctor called a harrowing accident. A fall from the barn loft, head first, onto the packed earth below. Everyone had offered their condolences, whispered prayers and left casseroles wrapped in linen, but Clara never cried. She had thanked them quietly, her expression unreadable, then shut the door behind her and never spoke of him again. In Cooper's Hill, silence always inspired gossip. Some said she was in shock. Others believed she was incapable of grief. The most superstitious among them claimed her love for Jonathan had already curdled into hatred long before the accident. After all, everyone had heard them fighting, loud, vicious nights that carried through thin walls and open fields. Yet no one dared confront her. There was something about Clara's stillness, her unblinking gaze, that made people uneasy. After Jonathan's death, Clara's behavior became stranger. She began painting, not landscapes or portraits like the women in the neighboring towns. Hers were walls, her own walls. She stripped the wallpaper from the dining room first, revealing rough timber, then began coating it in thick, uneven layers of deep red. She told Mrs. Halding, the grocer's wife, that she was restoring the home. "It needs new life," she said softly. "It needs to breathe again." But the color she used, murky, too dark to be any shade of paint sold in town, drew questioning eyes and quiet fear. Few people visited after that. Even the postman preferred leaving her letters at the gate rather than walking up the narrow path to the Vale farmhouse. On windy days, he swore he could smell something foul coming from the house, a coppery stench that turned his stomach. He mentioned it once to Sheriff Thompson, who dismissed it as nonsense. "Grief makes folks do strange things," the sheriff said, waving it off. "As long as she's paying her property tax and not shooting at anyone, let the woman be." Yet the townsfolk couldn't let it be. They whispered about her in the church pews on Sundays, watching from a distance as Clara slipped in during the final hymn, always wearing the same black dress, veil drawn low. She never looked up at the altar, never spoke the prayers. She only stood still, hands clasped tight in front of her, her knuckles white against the fabric of her gloves. By mid-August, the talk grew darker. 2 stray dogs disappeared near the edge of her property. Then a drifter heading north failed to reach the next town. The constable shrugged, saying men like that vanished all the time. But the mothers stopped letting their children wander beyond the market road. At dusk, the forests around Cooper's Hill seemed to hold their breath. Inside her house, Clara worked tirelessly. Her kitchen floor was covered with drop cloths, jars, and basins. For days, the sound of scraping and brushing echoed through the night. Her hands grew stained, her nails blackened from mixing pigments that no one could identify. She hardly ate. Her once rosy face turned pale and sallow, yet her eyes seemed brighter, more alive than ever, as if something inside her had awakened. One evening, as the sky bled orange across the horizon, Mrs. Halding finally gathered enough courage to visit. She carried a small basket of bread and berries, insisting to herself it was an act of kindness. She knocked 3 times. At first, no answer. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate. The door opened a crack and Clara appeared. The light behind her glowed a deep, unsettling red. The smell that drifted out was thick, metallic. "Evening, Mrs. Vale," Mrs. Halding stammered, her throat dry. "I thought you might need supper." Clara tilted her head. Her lips curved faintly into what might have been a smile. "That's kind of you, Margaret. Come in." Every instinct told Mrs. Halding to run, but pride and politeness betrayed her. She stepped inside. At once her breath stopped. The walls shimmered, wet under the light of an oil lamp. The entire parlor looked as though it had been dipped in liquid rust, dark, uneven streaks clinging like veins to the wood grain. A bucket sat in the corner, its contents thick and congealed. Her eyes widened. That smell, It wasn't paint. Clara noticed her stare. "Do you like it?" she asked softly. "It's fresh." The basket slipped from Mrs. Holding's hands, berries scattering across the floor. She stumbled backward, words tangled in her throat. "What is this?" she whispered. "Life," Clara said, stepping closer. "Everything in this house deserves a part of him. I couldn't let him go entirely." The color drained from Mrs. Holding's face. She turned and fled, tripping down the porch steps, the sharp wind biting her lungs. Behind her, Clara stood at the door, watching her run. There was no anger in her eyes, just calm acceptance, as though she expected nothing less. By dawn, the entire town knew. Men gathered with torches and rifles, muttering about madness and justice. Sheriff Thompson tried to reason with them, but they were long past reasoning. "If she's lost her mind," someone shouted, "then God help us all if we leave her there." They marched up the hill, boots striking hard against the frozen mud. Clara saw them coming from her window. She didn't hide. She didn't run. Instead, she set down her brush, wiped her hands on her apron, and sat in her chair by the fireplace. The red walls around her pulsed softly in the flickering light. Outside, the sky turned grey and snow began to fall. As the mob reached her porch, the last sound Clara heard before the door burst open was the steady, rhythmic crackle of fire consuming wood. They found her smiling, surrounded by the color she had created. And though no one spoke it aloud, each man who entered that house swore he felt something slick beneath his boots and heard, faintly, the sound of something still dripping. When they left, the snow outside had turned a delicate shade of pink, but that was only the beginning of the story, because the horror of Clara Vale did not die with her. The morning after they stormed the Vale house, Cooper's Hill woke to silence, the kind that lingers in the air after something terrible has been done. Snow blanketed the fields, disguising what had happened only hours earlier. But everyone in town knew. They said the sheriff had found Clara sitting in that chair, her eyes open yet empty, as if she had already left long before they arrived. Some believed she had taken her own life. Others claimed she'd simply stopped breathing, her body refusing to exist any longer in the same world as her husband's stain. They buried her in the churchyard under the old oak tree, without ceremony, without hymns. Reverend Pike refused to speak over her grave. "The woman who defiled the gift of life," he said sternly, "and turned death into art." The few who gathered kept their eyes low, their breaths turning white in the wind. The ground was frozen, and the gravedigger's shovel struck the earth with the dull sound of guilt. When the coffin disappeared into the soil, most believed that would be the end. Cooper's Hill would return to normal. The whispers would fade, the smell would drift away, and the Vale house would be left to rot quietly at the edge of town. But peace did not come. The days after Clara's burial marked the beginning of a far subtler kind of terror, one that couldn't be driven away with torches or prayers. It began with the children. 3 days after the funeral, little Noah Holding, the grocer's son, came home with red smears on his hands. His mother gasped when she saw him and scrubbed them with soap until his skin turned raw. "I was just playing," he insisted. "Near the old house." She swore and told him never to go near there again, then locked every door and prayed until morning. The next day, another child said he saw someone in the Vale window, a woman standing still, her face shadowed, staring out toward the road. The sheriff checked, expecting trespassers, but the house was locked and empty. Snow had piled at the door, untouched, yet something about the air unsettled him. He'd been inside before on that night, and the smell had seeped into his memory. This time there was no stench, only a faint perfume, floral, almost sweet, like lilacs pressed between decaying pages. He left quickly, telling no one what he felt, that he'd heard the faint creak of floorboards behind him, though no one was there. By the end of the week, strange noises echoed after dark. Knocking, scratching, a sound like someone dragging a brush slowly across wood. Families shut their shutters early. Men who once mocked the stories now crossed themselves before bed. Cooper's Hill had grown small under its own fear. Still, life had to continue. The town had goods to sell, cattle to raise, and the memory of Clara Vale to bury again each day. Then came the disappearance of Sheriff Thompson. He was last seen on January 3rd, riding his horse toward the Vale property. He'd been restless for days, muttering about unfinished business. His deputy found his horse 2 nights later, reins torn, circling near the frozen creek. There was no sign of the sheriff, only his lantern, still burning, resting beside the front gate of Clara's house. A search party went out the following morning. Fresh snow had fallen again, wiping away any tracks. Inside the house, everything remained untouched, furniture draped in dust, windows half frozen shut. And yet, one thing was different: the red walls. The color had changed. Not darker, not lighter, just fresher, as if someone had painted them again. The men said nothing at first. They left quickly, swearing to one another not to speak a word. But fear has a way of slipping between vows. By nightfall, the story spread. The sheriff had joined Clara's walls. Soon after, the townsfolk began leaving Cooper's Hill one by one. Those who stayed avoided the northern end, where the Vale farmhouse stood like a scar. The church closed first. Reverend Pike left with his family after claiming to see muddy footprints near the altar one morning. Bare feet, too small to be a man's, too large to be a child's. The grocer sold his shop and vanished south. Only a handful remained by the end of winter, most too poor or too stubborn to abandon what generations before them had built. For months, the house stood quiet. Only the wind touched it, moaning through broken shutters. Then spring came. The thaw revealed the old path to the door, and for the first time in months someone returned. Her name was Abigail Wren, a journalist from Portland. She arrived by train, coat buttoned high, pen and notebook tucked beneath her arm. She'd heard the stories, every one of them, and wanted to see the place herself. "Superstition sells," her editor had told her. "Write it down, make it sound haunted." But Abigail wasn't interested in ghost tales. She was interested in truth. Cooper's Hill was almost deserted by then. The few remaining residents warned her not to go near Clara's house. They spoke of strange lights at night, of cries heard on the wind. But Abigail was resolute. The train fare had cost her nearly everything, and she wouldn't return without a story. She reached the farmhouse at dusk. The building leaned slightly, tired from years of neglect. Shattered shutters creaked with every gust. The porch groaned under her weight. She pushed the door open, unlocked, and stepped into a stillness so deep it made her ears ring. Dust hung like fog in the air. Her steps echoed softly, and then she saw them, the walls, the deep, impossible red. It hadn't faded. It looked alive. Abigail approached, unable to stop staring. Her breath caught when she realized the paint wasn't dry. It glistened faintly under her lantern's light. She touched it, just a brush of her fingertip, and felt it warm against her skin. She jerked her hand back, the door creaked behind her. Wind, she told herself. She turned her lantern toward the noise. Nothing moved. Yet when she looked back at the wall, she froze. There, among the uneven strokes, something took shape. Letters faint but unmistakable. Words emerging where there had been none. "You see me," her heart thundered. The lantern trembled in her grip. She stepped back, her breath sharp and shallow. The floorboards groaned softly once from upstairs. Abigail's fear turned cold. She forced herself to whisper, "Is someone here?" No answer, only that slow dripping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing faintly from above. She raised her lantern toward the staircase. Each step complained under her boots as she ascended. The air changed, thicker, warmer. By the time she reached the landing, her throat stung from the burning odor of iron. The first door stood slightly open. Inside, a dim glow pulsated against the floor. She pushed gently, and the hinges screamed softly. The smell hit her first. Then she saw the walls, still red, still wet, and a chair facing the window. Someone was sitting there. Abigail froze in the doorway, the lantern trembling in her grip. The light quivered across the red-stained walls, glinting like wet varnish. A woman's outline sat rigid in the wooden chair, her back to the journalist. The body was still, unnaturally so. Gooseflesh prickled up Abigail's arms. She managed to whisper, "Hello." Her own voice vanished into the thick silence. The chair did not move. Gathering what courage she could, she stepped inside. The air reeked of iron and damp wood, heavy enough to choke her. The edges of her vision blurred as adrenaline sharpened every sound. The creak under her boots, the faint drip somewhere near the wall, the pulse in her ears that no longer felt like her own. Slowly, she circled until the lantern's light caught the woman's face. The features were unmistakable, porcelain pale, The same calm expression burned into every sketch of Clara Vale that had circulated across Maine after her death. But something was wrong. The eyes, they were open, reflecting the orange glow of the lamp, yet glassy and sunken, as if seeing through time. Her lips were parted slightly, and what looked like dried pigment outlined the corners of her mouth. Abigail stumbled back, hitting the doorway. It couldn't be real. Clara Vale had been buried. She had read the official records herself. Yet the evidence sat before her, frozen in that chair, colorlessly human like a portrait left unfinished. Abigail forced a deep breath. Logic fought the rising panic. It must be a display, she thought. Perhaps someone had staged it to scare visitors. A cruel trick. She lowered her lantern to the floor and leaned closer. Clara's hands rested on her lap, her fingers curled inward as if holding an invisible brush. The nails were cracked and darkened. On the floor near her feet lay dried drops, the same deep red that marked the walls. Abigail reached into her coat for her camera and set it carefully on the floor. But as she adjusted the lens, a soft noise rose behind her. Faint at first, then clearer, a breath. Slow, deliberate, drawn between thin lips, she spun around. The chair was empty. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The camera clattered to the floor. The chair remained rocking slightly, wood moaning under invisible weight. The red walls seemed to pulse in the lantern's glow. Instinct took over. She ran down the stairs into the hall. Her boots splashed through something slick. The floor shone dark beneath a layer of liquid that hadn't been there before. She pushed through the door, bursting into the freezing night. She didn't look back until she reached the old gate, lungs burning from the cold air. When she finally turned, the farmhouse windows flickered with light. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing behind the glass. A woman, motionless, head tilted, not Clara perhaps, but watching all the same. Abigail didn't stop running until the town lights appeared faintly in the distance. The station master was the only man awake when she arrived. It was just past midnight, the wind scraping snow off the platform planks. "Train's not till morning," he muttered without looking up. Abigail's coat was soaked, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold her notebook. "Please," she whispered, "telegraph Portland. Tell them something happened up there." The man frowned. "Up where?" "The Vale house," she said. "There's something wrong." Her voice turned raw. "Someone needs to come. Sheriff, police, anyone." He set down his pipe, finally lifting his gaze. His expression was weary, skeptical. "You ain't from around here," he said quietly. "We stopped sending men up there months ago." "Doesn't change a thing." Abigail bit down a cry of frustration. "You don't understand." The station master sighed and pointed toward an old notice board near the ticket counter. Pinned there, half faded by dust, were photographs, small portraits marked with black crosses. At the top, Sheriff Thompson. Below him, 3 others. "The search party. They went looking for answers too," the old man said. "Never found 'em." Abigail stared at the photographs, her pulse slowing into dread. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows, carrying a faint echo from the hills, like the hum of a distant voice. By morning, the town square was abuzz for the first time in months. Word of the outsider's arrival had spread fast. Some called her brave, others reckless. A few men gathered around the diner counter to hear her story. When she described what she'd seen, the chair, the breathing, the vanishing body, none of them laughed. One by one, their faces shifted from disbelief to grim acknowledgement. Old Mrs. Keene, who'd lived in Cooper's Hill longer than anyone, spoke up softly. "That house don't want to be forgotten," she said. "It's fed on remembrance. Each time someone goes to look, it finds breath again." Abigail dismissed the superstition. "I'm not here for folklore," she said. "Something real is happening there. Someone might be living in that house." But even as she said it, she remembered the eyes. The reflection in them wasn't of her lantern, it was of fire. That afternoon, Abigail returned to the farmhouse with 2 volunteers from the town, Sam Dyer, a carpenter, and Morris Hale, the blacksmith's son. Both men carried lanterns and axes, though their faces betrayed more fear than courage. The climb up the hill was slow through the damp snow. When they reached the gate, the wind had dropped to a strange, heavy stillness. "She's locked from inside," Sam murmured, testing the door. Morris raised his axe, but Abigail stopped him. "No, through the cellar." The back steps were half buried, but the cellar hatch opened with a groan. Stale air rushed out, cold and rancid. They crawled inside, lanterns trembling as they descended. Dust floated through the beams. The space was cluttered with old jars, rusted tools, and rows of strange containers labeled in Clara's handwriting. When Abigail lit one corner, she found something that made her throat tighten. Sheets of painted canvas stacked neatly, each showing the same thing. A woman sitting in a chair. Watching, every painting was slightly different. In some, her eyes were open. In others, they followed the viewer sideways. The final canvas, still wet, showed 3 figures entering the house. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. "We have to go," she whispered, but before they could move, a sound rose from above. The same dragging brushstroke she had heard before, slow and patient. The 3 exchanged terrified glances. The lanterns flickered. Morris swore under his breath and climbed the cellar steps. He pushed the door open and stepped through. The next moment he screamed. Abigail vaulted after him, lantern swinging wildly. The room above glowed again, alive with that deep-breathing crimson. Morris stood frozen at the center, his face white as ash. Across the far wall, a new fresh stroke glided upward, wet, gleaming, unmanned. She followed its path to the ceiling. There it was, a single trembling hand, pale against the red, pressing gently into the wall as if the whole house were exhaling color from within. The brush fell. The stroke ended. And from the shadows at the edge of the room, a calm voice whispered, "I told you. He's still here." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. The voice was soft, distinctly feminine, and came from the direction of the shadowed corner near the window. The lantern shook violently in her hand. Morris stumbled backward, knocking into a dusty cabinet, his axe clattering across the floor. Sam froze behind them, his face pale beneath the dim gold light. "Who said that?" Abigail whispered. No answer came, only the faint shuffle of fabric, the creak of the old floorboards bending under unseen weight. Then from the darkness that same voice again, measured, steady, almost peaceful. "You shouldn't have come back." The words carried a strange calmness that filled Abigail with a deeper dread than any scream could. She turned the lantern toward the sound. The red glow illuminated an old mirror leaning against the corner. The glass fractured in a dozen sharp lines, and in it, for just a moment, she saw the reflection of a woman standing behind her. A black dress, a narrow face, pale skin that glistened as though slick with something viscous. The reflection's lips moved, soundless this time. Abigail spun around, but the space behind her was empty. Only the humming wind outside the loose panes. Then came the smell. Iron and mold, thick and unmistakably human. Sam swore under his breath, clutching his lantern closer. The light revealed what had drawn the scent. Streaks along the wall that had begun to run again. Thin rivulets of dark liquid crawling downward like veins. It looked almost warm. "This isn't possible," Abigail muttered. "It's pigment or—" But her voice faltered as her eyes landed on the floorboards beneath them. Footprints were emerging one by one, damp and deliberate, pressing upward from nowhere. Each step neared the spot where she stood, frozen. Morris lunged for the door. It didn't move. The knob twisted uselessly in his grip. "It's jammed." Sam dropped his lantern, trying to help. The flame sputtered across the floor for a second before dying, throwing half the room into shadow. Abigail lifted her own lantern higher, desperate, her pulse thunderous in her ears. The last footprint stopped inches before her boots, then silence again. They stood like statues, breath shallow, waiting for another movement. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Finally, Sam managed to wrench the door open, splintering the rusted latch. The cold night air rushed in, cutting through the stench. They bolted outside, slipping down the steps and into the snow. The house loomed behind them, its windows reflecting their lantern light. Each pane glowed crimson. From somewhere deep within came a low rhythmic sound. Not human exactly, but unmistakably alive, like the pulse of something breathing through wood. Abigail wanted to stop, to look, to understand, but Morris grabbed her arm. "Don't," he hissed. "Just run." They ran until the road appeared. Snow whipped at their faces, lantern flames bending wildly in the wind. Only when the house disappeared behind the line of pines did they slow. Sam leaned against a tree, gasping, while Morris bent over, retching into the snow. Abigail clutched her notebook to her chest, realizing she'd been holding it the whole time. Its cover was streaked faintly with red. "What was it?" Sam finally said. "What did we just see?" Abigail's voice trembled. "Clara Vale," she met their eyes. "Or what's left of her." They walked back to town without speaking. The moonlight broke through clouds, washing the fields in pale blue. Every shape of fence post or tree stump made them flinch. When they finally reached the station road, Morris stopped and turned toward her. "We tell no one," he said firmly. "But people need to know," Abigail argued. "If something is alive in that house, if she is alive—" Sam interrupted softly, almost laughing. "What we saw wasn't alive. It was hungry." No one answered. The chill of his words followed them the rest of the way. That night, Abigail rented a room above the old post office, one of the few buildings still functioning. The keeper, Mrs. Lang, brought her a bowl of stew and a wool blanket, saying little except, "You look like you've seen a ghost." Abigail didn't correct her. Exhaustion weighed heavier than fear now. She sat by the small window, lantern dimmed, staring out toward the hill. Even from the distance, she could see a faint glow where the farmhouse stood, steady, as if a single room still burned with light. She took her notebook and began to write. Every detail of the night poured onto the page, the voice, the mirror, the footprints. She wrote until dawn's first grey light crept into the room. Only then did her hand still. Beneath all her notes, she wrote one final line: "Whatever she painted, it remembers." The next morning, Sam and Morris were gone. Their rooms empty, beds untouched except for faint muddy prints near the doors leading outside. The town seemed quieter than ever, as if Cooper's Hill itself had decided to stop breathing. Abigail demanded answers from Mrs. Lang, but the old woman only shook her head. "People leave here at night," she said. "Always think they can keep going. But the road, it turns them back." Abigail refused to believe that. She packed her bag and went to the station to buy a ticket out. The clerk, the same old man from before, looked at her name on the ledger and frowned. "Strange," he murmured. "Didn't you already leave?" "What are you talking about?" she asked. He turned the book toward her. There, in her own handwriting, was her name listed 3 days prior. Ticket issued, destination Portland, marked departed. The ink looked fresh. She stepped back from the counter. Her vision swam. "That's impossible," she said. But even as she spoke, the scent reached her, the faint, metallic trace she'd thought was buried in that house forever. When she turned toward the doorway, she saw it, a smear of red across the snow, faint as a fingerprint leading back up the hill. By dusk, the farmhouse glowed again, this time brighter, as though inviting her return. The rational part of Abigail begged her to walk away, to board the morning train whether it existed or not. But the journalist in her, the relentless seeker of truth, won. She followed the trail back through the woods, the light fading to violet behind her. When the house came into view, she stopped. It looked almost new, the sagging porch repaired, the windows gleaming, the chimney exhaling a thin column of smoke. For a moment she thought she'd come to the wrong place. Then the front door opened, a figure stepped out. A woman in a black dress, the same as before, yet her movements were fluid, graceful, alive. Her face, unmistakable now even in twilight, was serene. Clara Vale smiled faintly as if greeting an old friend. "Abigail," she said, her voice smooth, clear, untouched by decay. "I've been waiting." The journalist stood rooted as every word she'd written came rushing back. Clara extended her hand, pale and steady. The doorway behind her glowed that same deep color. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," Clara continued softly. "I only wanted to preserve what I lost. You understand that, don't you? You came looking. You saw." Abigail's voice broke. "You're not real." Clara tilted her head. "Then how am I speaking?" The wind whipped around them, carrying that iron scent again. The snow beneath Abigail's boots shimmered faintly red. She took one step backward, then another. Clara didn't follow. She only smiled wider, eyes glinting in the dim light. "Go if you wish," she said calmly. "But remember this. What is written becomes truth." She nodded toward the notebook clutched in Abigail's shaking hand. "And you've written enough to make me live forever." The wind fell silent. Abigail turned and ran, her footprints vanishing behind her almost as soon as they formed. When she reached the edge of the forest and looked back one last time, the farmhouse was gone. In its place, only a field of untouched snow, white, endless, clean, except for the faint crimson letters etched where the door once stood. The story continues. Abigail returned to Portland a week later, or at least that's what the conductor claimed. No one remembered her stepping onto the train at Cooper's Hill, and yet she arrived. coat torn, notebook clutched to her chest, eyes sunken with sleeplessness. She said little during the journey. Passengers recalled that she stared through the window without blinking, as though the landscape outside was a reflection rather than a view. When she reached the city, she went straight to her editor's office. The man, Harold Kent, was a heavy smoker with little patience for melodrama. But when Abigail entered, pale, trembling red stains on her sleeve, he dropped his cigar. "Good God, Wren, what happened to you?" "I have the story," she said. "But you won't want to print it," he frowned. "Try me." She placed the notebook on his desk. The pages were swollen from damp and streaked with faint pigment. He flipped through them with care, his expression shifting from curiosity to discomfort. "This is quite a tale," he said finally. "You realize if I run this, people will think it's fiction." Abigail's voice was slow and forced. "Then let them think so." "But publish it," he promised he would. When she left, the snow had begun to fall again, a late storm sweeping across the coast. She disappeared into it, and by the following morning her room at the boarding house was empty. Only her second notebook remained on the desk, open to the final page. The words were few but clear. "I hear the brush again." 2 weeks later, the piece ran in the Portland Chronicle under the headline, "The Widow of Cooper's Hill, an account of the Vale tragedy." It caused an immediate stir. Some readers called it the work of a gifted writer with a grim imagination. Others accused the paper of exploiting local superstition. But a handful noticed something the rest did not. Each printed copy showed faint stains across certain paragraphs, fine discolored streaks, brownish red, bleeding through the letters as though the ink itself had mixed with something else. The printing press was checked. The plates were clean. No one could explain it. Harold Kent dismissed the matter until the 4th day, when he entered the office early and found the door to the typesetting room ajar. Inside, one of his apprentices sat motionless at the table, staring at the wall. When the editor spoke, the boy did not answer. Only when Kent stepped closer did he see the horror. The boy's fingers were smeared with red, dragging letters across the plaster. The same words repeated over and over, "She's here. She's painting again." That issue was pulled from circulation the next day. The Chronicle folded within the year, its staff scattering to other papers. As for Cooper's Hill, it ceased to exist. The railroad stopped sending trains there after a storm destroyed the track north of Bangor. On old maps, the town still appears faintly, a faded name on the corner of Maine that no one visits. But sometimes, when the season turns and the air carries that metallic scent, collectors claim that early editions of The Widow of Cooper's Hill grow warm to the touch. Some swear ink begins to run again in the margins, slow, deliberate, like a brushstroke seeking form, and if you look closely enough, they say, the letters begin to spell a name. For nearly 30 years, the story of Clara Vale remained folklore, retold by travelers near firesides, reshaped with each generation's imagination. Some said her spirit haunted the hills of Maine, forever repainting her house in blood. Others claimed she'd been no ghost at all but a desperate woman, trapped by grief. Yet for those who worked in newsrooms, printing houses and libraries, her name carried a different weight, because every few years, inexplicably, her story found its way back into ink. In 1921, a graduate student named Thomas Blaine began cataloguing old Maine publications. Among them, he found a preserved copy of the 1893 Portland Chronicle article written by Abigail Wren. The paper had yellowed, the edges were brittle. But what unsettled him wasn't its age. It was the faint residue on the page, as if the ink hadn't fully dried, despite decades of storage. He brushed his fingertips across the heading and drew them back, startled to find a faint reddish smear. Thinking little of it, he filed the article under Urban Legends and took detailed notes for his thesis on early American sensationalism. That night, he dreamed of a woman in black standing behind him, her face half reflected in glass. She whispered in a measured tone, "You keep rewriting me wrong." He woke in a cold sweat, dismissing the dream as the cost of too much study. But the next morning he found something impossible. The words in his notebook had changed. His neat academic sentences were gone. In their place, messy strokes formed the phrase, "The walls remember." Startled, Thomas rewrote his notes, convinced he must have mixed pages. Yet when he looked again, the phrase appeared once more. this time scrawled across the margin of the chronicle itself, as if the ink had bled upward from somewhere beneath the paper. He locked the article away in the university archive, assigning it an anonymous number so no one would find it easily. A month later, the archive caught fire. It began in the early hours, long before dawn. The watchman reported that the flames spread unnaturally fast, crawling across the walls as though painted on by an invisible hand. When the firefighters arrived, they found no electrical fault, no source of fuel strong enough to explain the blaze. Amid the ashes, only a single artifact survived. The Chronicle article untouched, its paper strangely pristine, except for a deep red stain along the title's edge. On the back, in handwriting that matched none of the staff's, someone had written, "The story is never finished." The event became another rumor, folded into Maine's growing list of unsolved mysteries. Blaine never spoke publicly about it again, though colleagues said he grew withdrawn, his lectures erratic. Late one night, a janitor passing his office heard the sound of a brush dragging rhythmically over paper. When he entered, the room was empty except for the smell of iron and a single sentence written on the wall, "Tell her story true." Decades passed, the world modernized, the Vale tragedy buried under newer horrors. Yet in 1956, when a renovation crew unearthed the remains of the Cooper's Hill Foundation, they found something that drew national attention. Beneath layers of earth and root, in what had once been the farmhouse's basement, lay several intact canvases sealed within a wooden crate. The wood bore the initials CV. The paintings were unlike anything preserved from the 19th century. Brushwork violent and expressive, each portraying a woman framed by color so intense it seemed wet even under electric light. The art community reacted with fascination. Some called it an early example of psychological realism, others dismissed it as grotesque relics of madness. The museum that received the pieces displayed them under glass, proudly labeling them recovered works of Clara Vale, 1893. The public came in droves, drawn by curiosity and unease, but after only 2 weeks the exhibit closed abruptly. What drove the closure never made the newspapers. Attendants whispered that during the final night, the security guard assigned to patrol the hall was found unconscious near the display. When he regained sense, he claimed he'd seen movement within one of the canvases, the brushstrokes shifting, the red deepening to fresh color. He swore he heard a voice say, "Add the last stroke." The museum dismissed it as exhaustion, yet when the curators inspected the paintings, they discovered small differences in composition, subtle but undeniable. One portrait now showed the faint outline of a seated woman turning her head, mouth slightly open. The paintings were returned to storage, locked away in a temperature-controlled vault beneath the museum. Over time, rumor said the vault's humidity system often malfunctioned, and the maintenance staff refused to enter alone. Still, someone continued to sign the visitor logs, always with initials that read AW. By the 1970s, both townspeople and scholars had grown wary of the legend. Articles written about Maine's folklore occasionally referenced the bloody widow, but Clara's name was treated as superstition, her story obscured by skepticism. Yet in 1983, exactly 90 years after her death, a small publishing company in Boston prepared a commemorative book about American haunting myths. Its editor, a woman named Lila Carson, reopened research into the Vale case. Among her sources, she requested permission to reproduce one of the vault paintings for the book's cover. 3 weeks later, the project was abandoned. The publishing office closed without explanation. Those who visited afterward said the walls of the conference room had been stripped bare and repainted a certain shade of red. The cans of paint were unopened. To this day, no official record confirms what happened to that particular artwork. Some claim it was returned to the museum. Others insist it was destroyed. But every few years, a new edition of Clara's story appears, never credited, never identical, always containing some line or sentence that none of the editors recall writing. Invariably, that line references a woman painting in silence, waiting to be remembered. Wherever the original color came from, pigment, blood, or something in between, it remains impossible to erase. The hue is unique, neither crimson nor scarlet, resistant to analysis. Art restorers say it's still alive somehow, darkening when exposed to breath as though its senses being watched, and sometimes those who visit the vault late at night swear they hear faint strokes echo through the quiet air. The sound of a brush gliding slowly across a canvas, careful, patient, creating the next retelling, the next truth. In the spring of 1993, a historian named Michael Arden arrived in Bangor with a single obsession: to prove that the story of Clara Vale was more fact than folklore. He'd spent a decade studying obscure criminal cases, always searching for the point where history blurred into myth. What drew him to Clara wasn't the supposed hauntings, it was the records themselves. Something about them didn't fit neatly into the language of rumor. Death certificates misplaced, witness statements unsigned, dates rewritten multiple times in official logs. He discovered that every person who had tried to document Clara's life had vanished, withdrawn, or died within a few years. Abigail Wren presumed missing. Thomas Blaine institutionalized after the fire. Even the Portland Chronicle press operators had met early unexplained deaths. Arden, rational to the core, chalked it all up to coincidence. Legends last because people stop asking questions, he told his colleagues. And I intend to keep asking. He began his research at the Maine Historical Registry, sifting through aged property deeds and sheriff reports. Among the files, he found a thin letter sealed inside an envelope marked "Private, do not exhibit." Dated 1893, it was addressed to the state coroner from Sheriff Thompson himself, the same sheriff who vanished the night he returned to the Vale property. The ink was nearly illegible, but one line stood out clear: "The blood on the walls refuses to dry." Arden read it 3 times before folding it carefully into his folder. He saw it not as proof of anything supernatural, but as evidence of hysteria spreading through the small, isolated community. He planned to compile the incidents into a paper on collective paranoia in 19th-century rural towns. Yet as he dug deeper, something began to shift. The archives themselves fought him. Files went missing from their drawers. A photograph he'd examined one day would be gone the next, leaving no trace it had ever existed. One evening, while cross-referencing records in the dim light of the archive room, Arden left briefly for coffee. When he returned, his notebook lay open to a new page he hadn't written. In neat cursive, faint and brownish, was a single phrase: "You've come far enough." He called the janitor, assuming it was a prank, but the man swore no one had entered the locked room. That night, he dreamed vividly. A woman sitting before a canvas that bled color, a brush moving of its own accord. When he woke, his fingers were stained red. Startled, he scrubbed his hands raw, telling himself it was ink from old documents. Still, the faint trace wouldn't wash away. Days later, he visited the remains of Cooper's Hill, now an overgrown patch of forest. The locals avoided it, warning of sinkholes and wildlife, but curiosity overruled sense. He found nothing at first, just shards of old timber and frost-sealed earth. Then, half buried beneath roots, he discovered stone steps leading downward. At the bottom was a hollow smaller than a cellar, its walls still lined in wood. The beams were stained with faint streaks that looked too deliberate to be rot. In the dim light of dusk, they shimmered ever so slightly. As he leaned closer, he noticed brush marks, thin looping lines preserved beneath resin or sap. They formed the outline of words, though only one was still readable. "Wait." A sudden chill swept through the chamber, snapping his breath short. He climbed back to the surface, hands trembling though the air outside was still. He told himself it had been an illusion of shadow and age. But when he reached his car, he noticed something on his sleeve, a thin red smear. Over the following weeks, Arden's research grew frantic. He began seeing the phrase painted alive in references he swore hadn't contained it before. His notes multiplied with scrawled repetitions of her name, though he didn't recall writing half of them. Colleagues described him as distracted, his mind elsewhere, fixated on the color. He spoke of it constantly, saying it was not pigment but memory, something organic, unwilling to fade. Eventually, he presented his findings at a small historical conference in New Haven. Those who attended the session later described it as uncomfortable. Arden appeared pale, exhausted, and strangely euphoric. His slides displayed distorted images, portraits that seemed to shift when the lights flickered. He ended his lecture abruptly, whispering into the microphone, "She finished it." No one understood what he meant. He disappeared the next morning from his hotel room. Months later, a parcel arrived at the university where he'd worked. It contained his research notes and one small canvas wrapped in newspaper. Inside the parcel was a letter, unsigned, postmarked from Maine. It read simply, "The last brush returned to its maker." When the archivist unwrapped the canvas, she gasped. It was painted in deep red oil, depicting a man at a desk surrounded by papers. The likeness unmistakable. Michael Arden, frozen mid-gesture, brush in hand. The painting was catalogued and stored in the university's restricted collection. Within weeks, strange reports surfaced. Security claimed to hear tapping after hours, brush against wood. One professor who studied the painting described the red tones as unsettlingly wet. Another insisted that under certain light, the subject's eyes seemed to move. The dean ordered the work locked in a basement vault and later, fearing attention, had it quietly transferred to a museum in Boston, the same one that once stored Clara Vale's surviving paintings decades earlier. The crate was sealed, labeled with a caution notice about chemical instability. Yet when curators logged the cargo, they discovered the box already bore a faint inscription carved into the wood. 5 letters, uneven but clear, written in cursive script, Vale and beneath in smaller carving, barely legible in the dim warehouse light. One more story. By the year 2025, the Vale name had almost vanished from public memory. The farmhouse long gone. Cooper's Hill erased from maps, its land repurposed into managed forest. Yet in a quiet corner of Boston's Museum of Regional History, a curator named Evelyn Marsh came across a crate without registry. Its label aged beyond legibility, its wood faintly tinged red. Museum protocol demanded it be opened, documented, and sampled for restoration. Evelyn was meticulous, patient, and privately skeptical of ghost stories. She'd never heard of Clara Vale before that morning. When she pried the crate open, the smell hit her first, musky wood and iron dust. Inside lay a single framed canvas wrapped in decayed linen. She cut through the layers carefully, revealing an image so dark it seemed to devour the light around it. The portrait showed a woman facing forward, her hands resting on her lap, eyes half-lidded, mouth unreadably calm. The red pigment in the background glowed faintly, refusing to reflect properly in the overhead lights. When she tilted the frame, it appeared to shimmer wetly like liquid trapped beneath glass. She logged it quickly. Unlabeled portrait, late 19th century, probable Maine origin. Condition: stable surface paint, possibly ferric oxide compound. She sealed it in plastic and set it aside for later evaluation. But what Evelyn didn't note in the report, what she couldn't explain, was that for a moment after unwrapping it, she swore the subject's gaze shifted very slightly, just enough for her to feel seen. That night she stayed late in the lab, cross-referencing similar pigment formulas. The museum's lights dimmed automatically at 9, leaving only the low hum of the servers. On her desk, the uncovered portrait stood propped against the wall. She kept glancing at it, half annoyed by its strange luminosity. When she finally rose to cover it, her shadow spilled over the red background, and something in the reflection caught her breath. In the glass's faint glare, a second figure stood behind her reflection. Another woman, green-grey hue, her hair pinned up, her eyes direct. Evelyn spun around. The lab was empty. It took her several minutes to regain composure. She convinced herself it was refraction, a play of light, and yet when she checked the surveillance camera feed, the footage glitched precisely at the moment she turned. A single static frame remained frozen on screen. Evelyn facing the camera, someone else faintly visible behind her, shape indistinct, leaning close. 2 days later, restoration work began. She placed the portrait under microscopic analysis. The pigment revealed no anomaly except one, a biological component not consistent with any recorded in 19th century oils. Hemoglobin traces, though degraded, were irrefutable. She sat back from the microscope, pulse quickening. "Impossible," she muttered aloud. After closing time, she took the painting home against policy, determined to study it privately. Her apartment overlooked the Charles River, its walls white and bare. She set the portrait near the window and began to write a report summarizing the data. Hours passed unnoticed until the city lights outside dimmed, as if consumed by fog. Then came the scent, metallic, sharp, unmistakable. She turned toward the painting. In the low lamplight, the red had changed. Deeper now, black around the edges, wet sheen catching each flicker of flame. The woman's lips curved upwards slightly. Evelyn dropped her pen. It rolled across the floor, tapping once beneath the table. When she bent down to retrieve it, faint sound broke the silence, a brush gliding through thick liquid. The noise came from behind the canvas. She froze. Against reason and self-preservation, she reached forward and touched the frame. The surface was warm. The first stroke appeared across the bottom edge, thin and trembling, still damp. It ascended slowly, deliberate, as though guided by invisible hands. The smell thickened. Evelyn stumbled backward, eyes wide, muttering that she was hallucinating. Her knees struck the chair, her back hit the wall. She tried to call someone, anyone, but her phone gleamed black, dead battery. The noise continued, methodical, painting unseen details inside the portrait that wasn't supposed to move. Then a voice behind her, calm, as if from inside her skull. "Every story ends in witness." The voice was not angry or ghostly. It was simply real, close enough to feel the breath of it. She turned. There was no one, only the mirror on the opposite wall reflecting her own horror. And behind that reflection, a faint figure seated, brush-poised. Evelyn screamed once, the sound swallowed by the room's low hum. When she looked again, the painting's subject was no longer alone. Another figure stood beside her, half-finished, lines sketching themselves in faint red strokes, defining short hair, spectacles, and a familiar expression of disbelief, her own. By dawn, the apartment was silent. The neighbors complained later of a strange odor seeping into the hallway. When police finally entered 2 days later, they found no sign of struggle, only Evelyn's work journal open beside the easel. Her final entry read, "Color responds to memory. Painting continues autonomously." The portrait stood against the wall. 2 women now side by side, Clara Vale on the left, Evelyn Marsh on the right. The museum quietly reclaimed the artwork, labeling it under a new accession number. No public statement was issued. Staff members handling the transfer noted small fresh droplets inside the sealed glass, though no source of moisture could be found. The curator's name was removed from official records, replaced with "Acquired anonymously 2025. Weeks later, the photograph of the painting appeared online. Art enthusiasts marveled at its eerie realism, speculating it was a digital hoax. Yet in each upload, subtle changes occurred. Sometimes the 2 figures seemed closer together. In others, faint brushstrokes in the background hinted at a third shape emerging from the shadows. Half visible, hand raised with a brush extended forward, as though inviting someone beyond the canvas to join. Late at night, museum staff claimed they hear faint tapping echo through the basement storage vaults, steady and rhythmic, as if someone were painting unseen. Guards dismiss it as pipes contracting with cold, but one janitor swore that when he leaned close to the frame one evening, he heard a whisper pressed against the glass. "Your turn." Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.